Hello, my fellow Fremen filmic failures. This is DS Lyons of the Movie Blues. And today on the show, we are going to be covering Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2 in a spoiler-free discussion and review. I got to catch this movie early in IMAX last night at a fan-first event. While reviews have pointed to this film being the science fiction version of Lawrence of Arabia or The Two Towers for the space age, I am here to report that Dune Part 2 might be more polarizing of a film than some are expecting. And that's for book purists and just movie fans alike. Of course, there is a tremendous amount to love with this movie, so let's pack a slightly more mixed bag than Dune Part 1 and head to the sands of Arrakis.
Oi! What do you bloody mean, mixed bag master? How bloody friggin' dare you?
I know.
I made sex to that damn popcorn bucket, and now you're gonna tell me my whole life is a lie?
Look, this wasn't what I expected to say here either. I thought this was going to be like an easy home run, like a 4-page script.
Oh, master, just tell us, has the sleeper awakened or not?
I wish it were that easy to unpack, my little gray friend. Dune 2 is a massive bag to unpack, and a film this dense and this ambitious has consequences both great and terrible, like the legacy of Paul Atreides himself. So join me for this spoiler-free discussion of what works and what, sadly, doesn't about Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2. After having watched the first Dune upwards of 6 or 7 times now, as well as having a lifelong obsession with the series and its various adaptations, to say that I was excited for this film is a pretty grand understatement. While I think that Denis' Dune Part 1 was a sci-fi masterpiece, I also felt like that movie lacked the excitement, pace, and climax of a normal sci-fi film. Most of these complaints were probably caused by this series being imagined as anywhere between 1 and 3 films, with that meter always changing depending on the success of each entry. So yeah, the bottom line is, can Dune 2 round out this story in a way that pays off the first film, while finally delivering the meat and potatoes missing from our last course with Denis? Let's begin with a spoiler-free chat on the film itself. Let's get the good stuff out of the way first, the stuff you'd be able to recognize as good just from the trailer of this behemoth or having seen the first Dune. But yeah, let's run through it anyway, because that's my job here, and there was a lot to love. Hans, baby, Hans has done it again with a score that steps into a far more intimate and yet far more bombastic realm than the first film.
Maybe in the future we will not have regular beats. Maybe we will have actually progressed as human beings, that we don't need a disco beat to enjoy ourselves.
Delivering a gorgeous and haunting score that is full of cool new synths, abstract new twangs for places like Getty Prime, and otherworldly bizarre themes for new twisted characters like Fade Rafa. As gargantuan as the score are the visuals once again, this time taking the ornithopters and thumpers and worms of the first film and pulling a James Cameron by throwing an S on that and then multiplying them across a gorgeous and seemingly endless world of sand. Dune Part 2 is the amalgamation of quite possibly the most talented visual artists in the world right now, including Greg Fraser, who is a literal god of photography. The CGI and the minimalist designs of the ships and planets and cities of this world are taken to their next most logical endpoint in all of these gorgeous and haunting angular tableaus of futuristic tech and worlds. As strong as the music and the visuals, are once again the performances of this incredible cast that Denis has culled together for these films. Timothée Chalamet finally becomes Muad'Dib with bravado and a relative insanity required for the role. Rebecca Ferguson delivers another absolutely delicious performance that feels more like Rose the Hat than boring sheriff lady from Silo. And holy shit, Austin Butler doing a mix between like Elvis and a lost Skarsgård brother was insanely compelling here, although I think we skipped a beat by not casting Peter Skarsgård in this role. I mean, come on, the man was right here, he already sounds exactly like his dad, but I digress. Chani is given a lot of room to grow here as a character, Zendaya once again proving why she is such a hot commodity in Hollywood right now. I still don't exactly understand why Christopher Walken was a good choice for the Emperor here. I don't really understand it now any better than when it was announced, but I guess he brought this cherub-like geezer vibe to the table that worked in its feebleness. Finally, and oddly, the real stars of the show here were Javier Bardem as Stilgar and Josh Brolin once again as Gurney Halleck. These guys were utter scene stealers. Bardem especially was hilarious, sweet, and surprisingly touching as Stilgar. I mean, he really surprised me here. Every once in a while, it seems like this guy is on total cruise control, and then the next movie he makes, he's like a weird gay guy in a suit pulling his jaw out. I mean, he's a great actor. Although, unfortunately, I don't know what movie Dave Bautista thought he was in this time around. Kind of felt like, I don't know, the first L that he's taken as an actor in his career renaissance thus far. It seems like
Raban
is just kind of like this screaming menace the entire movie. His emotional cadence is like kind of off from where all the other Harkonnens are at. They're kind of cool about being evil, and in this movie,
Raban
is kind of a dork about being evil, and it just like didn't rub in a very badass way, and it kind of felt like a lost opportunity to advance his character in a meaningful direction. Anyway, yeah, the visuals were incredible. The music was stellar. The IMAX presentation was once again, like Dune Part 1, one of the best I've ever seen. And the only thing that would have made my trip any better is if I had that damn forbidden popcorn bucket.
Oh, Master, you couldn't even secure a fleshworm bucket. What kind of critic are you?
I know, Bluesbot, it was a major L. So yeah, I ended up not being able to get the forbidden bucket. Like, I didn't realize that this was only a product one could get at an AMC location, and I had sadly chosen a Regal. So I got to the counter and I asked for the viral bucket of destiny, and the lowly snacksman told me that I was at the wrong theater chain. But he told me that they at least had a pretty cool Dune cup, which he even admitted was no match for the fuckable bucket, but I would simply have to make do. So I did my damnedest to fall in love with this thing, which was hard because it didn't even have a particularly big orifice. But regardless, I tried my best to have a good time with this thing, and I think we found each other in the noise. I think this is a love story now. So, my new soda cup girlfriend aside, how was the movie? Why am I burying the lead so much? Why does the time code of this video say that there's still so much time left? Because despite being wined and dined by my IMAX theater, despite returning to a universe that I love almost more than anything, it is my duty to report to you today that Dune Part 2 is a bit more of a mixed popcorn bucket with a fuckable mouth than the reviews have led us to believe. And I'm here to say that that's okay. I've made my peace with that, and I think I can accept this movie for its flaws because reasons. In short, Dune 2 fulfills the dreams of Part 1 and then kind of lingers around until those dreams become a nightmare. Dune 2 is a cornucopia of decisions both great and terrible, somehow working overtime to satisfy every book fan, every movie nerd, and every seat in the house regardless of their background. And to Denis Villeneuve, I tip my hat. To walk into the first Dune movie without a guarantee on even the second one must have been truly terrifying. How can you tell a story of half of a novel in a way that can be left on the shelf forever and admired for what it is? And I think that Part 1 achieved that, setting up a breathless, mystical, heavily iconic world full of mystery and allusions to prophecy. The first Dune was a poetic, minimal, sparse, yet visually dense film that did a tremendous amount of heavy lifting and introduced us to a modernized version of Frank Herbert's terrific and terrifying world. Part 2, on the other hand, is packed with visual wonder, splendiferous and eye-popping action and visuals, and is a film intent on upping the ante from the first film in nearly every conceivable way. And while Part 2 makes good on so many of these promises, it is also a film that loses some of the grace and streamlined prophesizing that made the first film so impactful. It seems like my worst initial fears about splitting Dune into two exact halves may have finally begun to rear their heads in Part 2. Because while the first film was this gracefully floating poem, Part 2 ends up having to pay the price of the vaguely underexplained first half in a second half that suffers from pacing, expositional dumps, strange editing choices, and occasionally a film that feels like it's absolutely sprinting at full speed towards its conclusion. At times losing the chance to relish in the most impactful or spectacle-filled moments because, after all, the clock is kind of ticking. What takes place over the span of several years in the novel takes place across 5 hours of 2 movies that's set over 6 or so fictional months on Arrakis. That's a lot of info to be packed into a 2-part film, and with Part 1 being purposefully vague to not overload the viewer with too much lore, information, world building, or characters, Part 2 no longer retains that luxury. There is a lot that Denis needs to unload here, and that's part of what I said when I warned that I was okay with some of the issues. Because I'm a nerd, I'm a Dune fan, a novel fan at heart. But I'm also a movie critic, and as the latter, it's my job to be upfront about how much Dune 1 avoided having to do, which Dune 2 needs to pick up and run with. Feyd is a perfect example of this conundrum. He is a character that we absolutely should have met in Part 1. His story running parallel to Paul's would have made him a better villain overall and would have made the final showdown even more breathtaking than it already was. And yeah, that final fight was amazing. But because we only had room for the Baron and Rabba in Part 1, now we need to stall out for 40 minutes in Part 2 to introduce Feyd, which, as a nerd, once again, I'm fine with. I thought the scenes on Getty Prime were so goddamn cool and did so much awesome character and world building for the Harkonnens at large that I was okay with it. I mean, this Coliseum was one of the best IMAX spectacle scenes I've ever seen, hands down. Watching the Baron smoking and smirking during all of this like he was goddamn Jabba the Hutt, I mean, this is Kino, baby. But as a film critic, I started to feel the weight of those decisions as the film went on. The same with the Emperor, like it was bizarre that this man wasn't in the first film, but it felt like that movie already had enough heroes and villains to keep track of. So this time around, they cast him as this super polarizing actor, and you think that that's some move to introduce him as this real force into the film like Butler was. But once again, Part 2 doesn't really have enough room to properly introduce this character, so now he's just a famous actor relegated to a background player. When, if he would have been in the first film, we'd have a much larger stake in his outcome as well. So yeah, there's a lot of that dissonance that occurs solely because of where and how the two films were split. As a Dune fan, I'm happy to see the lengthy conversational breakdowns on all sides of Paul's prophecies on all manners of Fremen life. But again, it's weirdly organized. I mean, the need for water, or the lack thereof on Arrakis, is such a fundamental thing that you have in the front of your brain in the novel Dune, from the very first pages when Paul gets to Arrakis. And like in Dune Part 2, they're finally introducing the methods of water collecting, the need for every drop, and the preciousness of its power on Arrakis. But like, for the fifth time, that feels out of order. And like something that if we would have established in the first place, it would have gained momentum throughout the series. Longest two-part story short, if you're gonna make a movie series like this based on something so holy, let the director cook. Let this French man cook. So much havoc was caused by the way these movies were handled and greenlit, and that only continues to hurtle in confusion to a potential third movie that seems to keep phasing in and out of reality. Thankfully, after this movie is going to be a huge smash, it will guarantee that film, which will then, once again, have to undo and overexploit things that neither Dune movie was allowed to do because it was 2 films and not 3. It's now becoming a series that is kind of racing to catch up with itself, and I felt it more in this half, and it made me feel at times not so good. In many different reviews, the comparison that people keep bringing up between Dune 1 and 2 are the differences and the progression between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, which is a spot-on comparison to a fault. Just like The Dark Knight, the villain here is better, the stakes are higher, the hero's quest becomes more complex, the world becomes far more real, and the director seems to finally be having fun with the universe that he carefully set up in the first film. Both Dune and Batman Begins have this modernization to their first films, a bringing of classic mythos into the light of our current timeline in a way that doesn't feel like the corny older entries from their respective franchises. And in that way, Dune 2 is a rollicking success. An escalation of events teased at the end of the first film, just like Batman Begins. But also like Nolan's first 2 Bat films, the second film seems to drop a lot of the poetry, grace, and mystery of the first film. In The Dark Knight, Gotham is no longer this mist-laden nut house that it was in Begins. Now it's this overexposed daytime cityscape. In The Dark Knight, Batman is no longer this force from the shadows to be feared, he's just kinda like Al Pacino from Heat with pointy ears. And just like I'm not here to say The Dark Knight sucks, I'm not here to say that Dune Part 2 sucks either, but both are subject to criticism, and I am a film critic. But I'm here to say that both films are far less streamlined, dreamlike, and euphoric than their predecessors. Both films suffer from odd pacing issues in their final acts as the directors both lose sight of their central themes in a mad dash to set up the pieces for another installment. Both The Dark Knight and Dune 2 lean heavily into the Empire formula, a second in the trilogy set of movies from the Star Wars playbook that lean on familial twists, massive losses for our protagonists, and an ending that will leave our characters strewn in different directions for another installment. Which, if you want to hear more about the Empire formula, check out my Empire Strikes Back video. I go into that for about 40 minutes. Very interesting. Check it out. And that's cool and everything. I mean, I love The Dark Knight, but with Dune Part 2, I thought we were kind of after a real resolution here, regardless of the books. I wanted to leave the theater feeling like I ingested the second half of a whole story, and that was not exactly what we ended up with here. Just like Paul Atreides himself, Dune 2 is a movie at odds with its own prophecies and unwilling to settle. This is clearly the second film in a trilogy, and if the series stopped on a dime here, it would feel like a majorly missed opportunity. And I don't know, there's a feeling of incompletion that accompanies that naturally. Regardless of its clashing structures and bizarre framing as a two-part film, most importantly and successfully, Dune 2 still manages to bring up all the things that make Dune such a unique and subversive hero's tale. If there's one thing that the noble houses and gilded empires of Dune all fear in equal measure, it's faith. And it is the consequences of faith that not only lead Paul Atreides' revolution against the Emperor, but it is faith that haunts his legacy, that poisons those around him, that darkens his future. In Dune Part 2, we find Paul Atreides straddling the line between religious fanatic and familial avenger. Two paths equally fraught with their own specific and disheartening consequences. Like all great men in power, Paul Atreides is a character who is faced with nothing but difficult choices, and the tragedies that will befall those caught in the wake of those choices. It's all a pretty dour, pretty upsetting, pretty heady load of stuff to be throwing around when it comes to a movie that comes with a fuckable popcorn bucket. But yeah, it's weird that there's this major popcorn movie, the biggest movie arguably on Earth right now, and it's like this RTS game of a movie series that's all about how utterly dangerous, terrifying, and ultimately deadly religious fanaticism can be, to those who practice it and also to those who fall victim to the practitioners. A lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to categorize Dune Part 2 into our current day lexicon, reaching towards things like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. But Denis' Dune doesn't really follow the same structure as those film series, and I find that extremely refreshing. The feeling of a journey truly ending, of evil being truly vanquished, and our heroes making sacrifices for the right reasons at the right times, those are typically the stories we see in our fantasy and our genre fiction. But Dune, in both novel form and in its many adaptations, attempt to tell a story where the magic and the mysticism of our heroes ends up causing worlds of suffering and loss. It's like what Rian Johnson failed to do with Luke Skywalker on a galaxy-wide scale, with the hero we were rooting for all this time and the magic he represents ending up as a tool of enslavement to the galaxy that he's trying to bring peace. In many ways, Atreides is closer to Anakin than he is to Luke, with Timothée Chalamet even making some moves in this film that truly showed the dark side to his character and the world he will bring on his path for vengeance and control. Dune Part 2 is a heartbreaking, mystifying, timeless, and gorgeous experience, much like the first. And just like the first film, it takes one of the densest texts in our cultural lexicon and distills it into something digestible, heart-pounding, and marvelous. Dune Part 1 and 2 are masterpieces in their own way, and they flow together in a symbiotic nature, each needing the other to survive as a narrative. But now it feels like we need a third film to properly round out the misconnections and prophecies of the first two films. And so once again, like the Fremen, we will have to bury ourselves in the sand and wait. Maybe after Part 3, now I can look back at Part 2 as if it's the centerpiece of one of the finest trilogies we've ever seen. Just like after Part 2, I can look back at Part 1 as, a great beginning of an origin story to one of the best trilogies we have ever. For now, Dune Part 2 feels like a traveler who didn't quite pack enough on his last trip massively overcorrecting and packing entirely too much for this trip, even if they are the finest clothes. If only like the sands of time I could go back and balance these two films, adding things from one to the other, and balancing the story in a way that felt a little more narratively satisfying. But being unable to do that, I will take the epic, genius, heartfelt, and incredible adaptations that are Dune's Part 1 and 2 from Denis Villeneuve. I hope you enjoyed the movie. I didn't think it was perfect, but surely is better than most things I've seen in my life. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I take this take too far? Did I end up making an embarrassing thumbnail that everyone's mad at me for? I haven't made it yet, but we'll find out. Either way, thanks for tuning in. I'm DS Lyons of the Movie Blues. Until next time.
Because I love you, and I love you, and I love you, and I've seen all your movies, and I love your movies, and I think you're the best.